One objection is, why should I even pay attention to private revelation? People say we don't need private revelation. When they say this, of course, there are two categories of revelation that are obvious to us in the church. There's public revelation and private revelation. Public revelation, now I think the words are slightly unhelpful, the names, public and private, because it sounds like out in the open and not out in the open. So it's slightly misleading, it's a bit of a red herring. Public revelation has nothing to do with it being out in the open. It's got to do with the revelation of Christ given to the apostles through the church, down through the ages, through sacred tradition and scripture, coming down to us. So the sacred deposit of faith, as Vatican II would call it, which lives in the church and comes to us from Christ through his apostles. Okay, so that's public revelation. It's what we have to believe to be Catholic. Private revelation then is any other apparition of Jesus or Mary or the saints or angels to any individual. Now, it could happen in a private room, it could happen out in public in front of 1 million people. That does not make it public. It remains private revelation, okay? And private revelation cannot teach us anything new about the faith. It cannot add to our faith, cannot subtract from our faith. So in this sense, it is true that we are not obliged to believe it. But if a private revelation is actually authentic, then we can say it's from God, and we would probably do well to heed it. And all private revelation can do, if it's authentic, is tell us what to do for our time. So for example, the revelations of the Sacred Heart to St. Margaret Mary Alacoque arose at a time when the heresy of Jansenism was rife. And Jansenism really is like the idea that we are totally unworthy of God. And nothing we do, of course we're unworthy of God, but almost like God barely tolerates us. It's a very negative spirituality. To combat that, our Lord himself revealed his Sacred Heart. Now, we already knew right from the beginning that the heart of Jesus is the heart of a divine person. The human heart of Jesus belongs to a divine person who loves us so much he even allows his heart to be pierced in death to show us, there's nothing he wouldn't allow to happen to him just for our salvation. And it's to breed confidence in God's love for us. Okay, so it's like an antidote to Jansenism. Now, and then of course in our own time, the devotion to the Divine Mercy, the revelations to Saint Faustina Kowalska, they are again for our own time to encourage people to trust in God's mercy for us, but also warning us that these are the times of mercy because a time of justice is coming. It's not just mercy for everyone, just like that. It's mercy, but mercy depends on repentance, conversion of life. And God is calling us to that. Okay, so revelations tell us what to do for our time. Marian apparitions, especially in the last couple of centuries, seem to tell us what to do for our time. With Lourdes and Fatima, the messages of penance, conversion, and Medjugorje is no different, I think, in that respect. It is about penance and conversion of life, living our life for God, and not just paying lip service. So this objection, saying, well, private revelation is not compulsory, is not necessary. Yes, strictly speaking, it's true, but if it is from God, then it's telling us what to do for our time. It's almost like you could say, lots of things are not necessary. Poetry is not necessary. But if you were like that, I think you'd be poorer for it. If you had no poetry in your soul, you'd never really experience great joys or really empathize with sorrows. You'd never really see beauty in the world around you, or you'd see it but be completely unable to appreciate it or articulate it. And I think it would be a loss to us if we ignored the private revelation that Holy Mother Church says is worthy of belief. Okay, even if Holy Mother Church doesn't compel us to believe it, she says it's worthy of belief, I think we ought to. We ought to listen to our mother. People object, why should I follow as yet unapproved messages or apparitions? So let's see if this is true. If we think about the examples of Lourdes and Fatima. Now Lourdes, the phenomenon began in 1858. It was approved 4 years later in 1862. And the bishop there, in his approval of it, said, the apparitions are supernatural and divine, and that by consequence, what Bernadette saw was the most blessed Virgin. Our convictions are based on the testimony of Bernadette, but above all on the things that have happened, things which can have nothing other than divine intervention, such as the conversion of sinners, miraculous cures, and the enormous crowds of the faithful who come spontaneously to the grotto, who have not ceased to come ever since the first appearances, and whose purpose is to ask for blessings or to give thanks for those already received. So there you go. With Lourdes, one of the reasons it's approved is the people coming there when it was not yet approved. Okay? And if we look at Fatima, we find something similar. The bishop there declared, when he approved it, he said that the children's visions are worthy of belief, and he permitted devotion to Our Lady of Fatima, and his reasons for this approval include the vast numbers of witnesses to the solar miracle, conversions, healings, and, quote, multitudes in their thousands coming from the four corners of the land who make their way en masse to Fatima, close quote. So there he mentions the solar miracle, people actually watching it when it was unapproved, and also the people coming to Fatima when it was unapproved, as yet unapproved. So this is actually part of the process Holy Mother Church uses to approve an apparition. So the objection that you can't go to somewhere unapproved, we see, is clearly not true. And also it's unhelpful, because the Church is looking to see, are people going there and what's happening in their lives, to be able to discern where Medjugorje is coming from. Is it really of supernatural origin or not? People sometimes object to the lives of the visionaries, as though all the visionaries should have become priests or nuns and pursued a religious vocation. And the fact that they did not in Medjugorje is somehow counted against them and held against them. Now here I think there's a confusion between being a visionary and with actual sanctity. To be a visionary, it's not because they deserve it, it's a grace, freely given. A visionary ought to become a saint, just like all of us ought to become saints. But we shouldn't assume that a visionary is necessarily a saint. Saint Bernadette really is quite exceptional. She showed a lot of prudence, wisdom, care. The other thing is, I said visionaries are not necessarily saints. We have to leave that space, Again, Saint Bernadette was lucky because she did not want to remain in Lourdes. She wanted to escape the crowds, and also the bishop and her family and the local pastor all had the wisdom to say, we need to move her out of Lourdes before she becomes a freak show. Okay, so she was lucky to escape. It was sad for her because she could never see Lourdes again. Her last apparition, because the apparitions began in February, March. And her last apparition is one that few people know about. It happened in July that year, where the crowds were already so big, she was already a celebrity, so she had to sneak in on the other side of the Gave, the river, and she looked at the grotto, and Our Lady appeared, and they were there, like 100, 200 yards apart, and they just smiled at each other and bowed. That was the last apparition she had, because she couldn't go up to the grotto because of the crowds. It's sad, it's poignant, but it kind of shows what could happen to a visionary. Now, I want to look at one particular apparition, La Salette in France, which happened just before Lourdes, where such wisdom did not apply. The mission of the shepherds is ended. The shepherds are the children, Melanie and Maxima. That of the church begins. They can move away, become dispersed in the world, even unfaithful to the great grace received. But the apparition of Mary will not thereby be shaken, for it is certain, and nothing coming after can act against it. And notice his wisdom. He says the apparitions are real, it's a great grace, and the visionaries might even be unfaithful afterwards, but that does not negate the reality of La Salette. And it's kind of prophetic he said that, because the two visionaries lived slightly chaotic lives. It's not their fault, I don't think. They were the first celebrity visionaries that we really know of, because people hounded them and chased them, elevated them to this great status. They didn't want it, but it had its effect. So what happened is that Melanie, the girl, she joined 4 different orders, religious orders, and she left all of them. She was dispensed from her vows, and then she died in a private house in Naples with a friend. And that's how her life came to an end. The boy, Maxima, is an even sadder story, because he flunked out of high school. He tried to become a doctor, that failed. He joined the army temporarily, then he was dismissed from that. He tried to train as a pharmacist, that didn't work out. And then he lent his name to a fellow who made liquor, kind of cashing in on the visionary fame. And this guy made a lot of money with the liquor, but cheated Maxima. And Maxima himself is supposed to have died penniless, alcoholic. He died in a state of grace, having received the last sacraments, but he was penniless and alcoholic. Like, really what the world would look at and say, this is a failure. This is not exactly how you expect visionaries to end up, but this is what happened to the two of them, because they are hounded and treated like celebrities. So we have to remember, visionaries are human beings. They're not saints. They're called to be saints, just like we are. We have to leave them alone. A serious objection is, what if Medjugorje is false? Are we putting our souls in danger by going there or listening to the messages of Medjugorje? This is something I think that is present in many people's minds. Because even if it's unapproved, and Holy Mother Church needs our going there as pilgrims to help her discern whether this is true or not, well, what if it's fake? Am I in any danger going to Medjugorje? Am I putting my faith in danger by going there? Now, to this, I want to give a quote from Archbishop André Joseph Léonard, the Archbishop of Brussels, and he was the former primate of Belgium. And he says, I quote, "I know bishop friends whose rule of behavior is to say, look out, if we are open to the events of Medjugorje, we can perhaps encourage something that is not authentic. There exists a risk. I am more sensitive to the opposite risk and say, just the same, it is possible that heaven has spoken to people at that place, and I do not wish to take the risk of a priori being closed to that grace. 2 risks exist. The risk that we are being deceived in Medjugorje, and the risk that we are bypassing a gift of grace. Until the judgment of the Church, between the 2 risks, I prefer to take the risk of being open rather than the risk of a priori being closed to the grace of God, which can be operating in this place. Accordingly, therefore, I take the position of openness and prudence." Notice what the Archbishop says, openness and prudence. Prudence is practical wisdom. So he's basically saying there are 2 risks in Medjugorje. There's the one risk, it could be fake. And although he doesn't fully spell it out, if it's fake, people are being deceived. And what are they being deceived into? Praying the rosary every day, going to Mass, reading the Bible, fasting on Wednesdays and Fridays, and going to confession at least once a month. They're deceived into living a sacramental life more fully. Really? If that's a deception, oh, happy deception. Would that the whole world were deceived in this way. And of course, the other risk he's saying is that it could be a grace from God, and that there's a greater risk, it's a greater danger to be closed a priori to the grace of God, to say, well, no, I'm not going to have anything to do with this. But if it is from God, we're risking bypassing God's grace. And I think to this I'd also want to add some Dominican wisdom. You know, my brothers, when I first started going there as a priest with the laity, they asked me a few questions about Medjugorje. How do people behave at Mass and adoration? What are confessions like in Medjugorje? And the behavior of priests in general in Medjugorje. And when I answered these questions, they said, clearly God's grace is at work in this place. We must cooperate with this. I remember I was at adoration. Adoration in the evenings in the summer is at the back of church, and there's seating for 7,500 people. So roughly I'd calculate there were about 10,000 people kneeling down in silence, adoring our Lord in the Blessed Sacrament in the monstrance. And there was an African priest next to me, and he looked out, because you see the priests are sitting on one side in the sanctuary, and the people are all down there on the other side. And he looked at the crowds of people and he said, now I know Medjugorje is real. When he saw how people were adoring our Lord, and 10,000 people in silence adoring Jesus. I don't think you can fake that. You can't fake that. And you have to have your eyes open to see God's grace at work where He chooses to work. It's not for us to decide whether the apparitions are true or not. Holy Mother Church will tell us when she's good and ready. But in the meantime, we're not blind. We can see God's grace is at work here. All the conversions taking place, so many conversions. I've heard some people kind of minimize it and say, oh yeah, people go to Medjugorje and have a little kind of pick-me-up. I think you have to be willfully blind to say that. There are authentic conversions taking place. People's lives are transformed. People are turning back to Christ. If we can see God's grace is at work there, then we have to say, well, we have to cooperate with God's grace and be open to it. There's a kind of expectation that visionaries should become nuns or priests or monks and pursue a religious vocation. And even if they don't do that, even if people don't expect that, they still think, well, if you're a visionary, you should more or less live like a hermit or live as a great saint, etc. Saint Bernadette really is quite exceptional. She showed a lot of prudence, wisdom, care. For example, her little brother showed some pilgrims the way to the grotto, and I think it was her brother Pierre, and they gave him a nice big silver coin, and he was so pleased with himself. He came back home and showed the whole family, look what I got, from the pilgrims. And Saint Bernadette, when she saw that, she slapped him and she said, go back now and give it back. We must not take money from the pilgrims. Okay? And then later, when she was in the convent at Nevers, she heard that her sister Tony, Antoinette, had opened a shop and was selling rosaries. And she wrote to her very angrily and said, shut that down now and stop. And Tony, to her credit, wrote back equally vehemently and said, look, I need to live. We have no other means of making money. And then Bernadette said, okay, but make sure you never become rich. Okay? But even in Bernadette's time, people said nasty things about the apparitions and Bernadette's family. They said, oh, look, the Subiru, they used to live in the kasho, the dungeon, and now they live in a fairly decent place. And, the father's got a job, the mother doesn't have to work so hard anymore. This is all a bit suspicious. This is a bit too convenient. Okay? They said that about Bernadette. They said that about the kids at Fatima, because the place of the apparition was on land owned by the uncle, which was then sold to the church. The family made quite a bit of money out of it. They rebuilt the house. They lived a more comfortable life after the apparitions. The family lived a more comfortable life. Okay, the two kids, Francisco and Jacinta, suffered horribly and died soon after, and Lucia then had to go off to the convent. But the rest of the family, they lived fairly comfortably. They were really poor before the apparitions, but after the apparitions, it's kind of suspicious, you could say. I'm not suspicious, okay? I'm just saying people were suspicious and said nasty things about them. So when people say the same sort of thing about the visionaries in Medjugorje. I'm not surprised. They've done it before, they'll do it again. This is human nature. But I want to address the fact that the visionaries did not become religious. This, I call it a Vozu syndrome. This is my own thing that I made up, okay? And it's called Vozu, named after Saint Bernadette's novice mistress, who later became Mother Superior, Marie-Thérèse Vozu, because she said that she saw herself as being far more worthy than Bernadette to receive an apparition. In her own words, I quote, "If the Holy Virgin wanted to appear somewhere on earth, why would she choose a common illiterate peasant instead of some virtuous and well-instructed nun?" She meant herself, I think. And I think a lot of people suffer from this. They see the visionaries and they judge them to be unworthy, and they are unworthy, of course. And they think, well, I'm better than that, but how come the Blessed Mother hasn't appeared to me? Well, we don't know. We don't know who God chooses to send Our Lady to. It's not up to us to decide, okay? Sometimes people object and say, well, the Blessed Virgin Mary does not make appointments, because in Medjugorje, she appears at certain fixed times and dates prearranged. And they hold this as an objection against the authenticity of Medjugorje. Well, I think it's quite practical, because if she wants to appear to you, you have to make sure that you're there and not elsewhere, like gone to your doctor's appointment or gone bowling or something. Like what Juan Diego, especially, she says, come back, same time, same place. And he wants to go back, but his uncle is sick. So the next day, he actually takes a detour. He tries to avoid her. And then she comes down the mountain and catches him and says, where are you going? So when she says, come and meet me at this time and place, she's quite serious. And we ought to take that seriously. Lord, she says, will you do me the great grace of coming here for 15 days? So she makes an appointment. And Fatima, she says, come back here for 6 months on the 13th of every month. So from all this, we see that the Mother of God is perfectly capable of making appointments and appearing at a predetermined place and time of her choosing. So that doesn't sound like a valid objection to say, well, no, the Mother of God doesn't do that. Well, we've seen that she does. Another objection to Medjugorje is based on some of the alleged messages of Medjugorje, as though some of them might be contrary to our faith. For example, there's an early message where I think the context was a little Serbian Orthodox boy was cured, and apparently I think a Franciscan priest expressed surprise at this. Now you have to understand, in the former Yugoslavia, there are a good number of ethnicities. There are Slovenes, Croats, Serbs, Muslims, who are now called Bosniaks. Okay, that was their ethnicity. Montenegrins and Macedonians, at least 6. They're all closely related to each other, and in fact, Bosniaks, Croats, and Serbs are really, really closely related to each other. The language is more or less the same, and the people have so much in common. Okay, but they do think of themselves as different. And in the former Yugoslavia, and in the countries that now exist, which represent the former Yugoslavia, so the countries of Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Serbia, etc., religion and ethnicity are always confused, okay? Because if you were a Croat, you were Catholic. So you didn't even have to say you were Catholic. You just say, I'm a Croat, meaning you're Catholic. Or you'd say, I'm Catholic, meaning you're a Croat. They couldn't see the difference. So the same, if you're a Muslim, you're a Bosniak, and vice versa. And if you're a Serb, you're Orthodox. Okay, so they did not make the distinction between religion and race or ethnicity the way we do in other countries. They were just kind of confused and jumbled. So the alleged message is Our Lady is supposed to have said, all religions are equal before my son. It is you on earth who create divisions. Okay? Now, when we hear a message like this, first of all, we have to understand there's that principle, the sound principle from St. Thomas Aquinas. He says, everything received is received according to the manner of the recipient. Okay, so if I explained to a crowd of people about quantum mechanics or astrophysics, they're all going to understand me according to their own language, vocabulary, and limitations, and their own experiences. And if they then were asked to repeat, what have you just learned, and repeated it, each one would repeat it in a way unique to him or her. Okay, so everything received is received according to the manner of the recipient. So if a visionary uses the word religion in Bosnia and Herzegovina, really, religion means ethnicity for them. Certainly did at that time. So all religions are equal before my son. We have to understand it as all ethnicities, all peoples. Because here the objection was, how come a Serb Orthodox was cured? And of course, you have to also wonder why was a Franciscan puzzled by that, because of the I suppose, bad feeling, bad blood, confusion among those people, mutual, perhaps mistrust, I don't know, at that time, and then which was made worse by the war in those countries, in Bosnia and Herzegovina and Croatia. And of course, all along, Our Lady was calling for peace between peoples. Okay, so here, this message, all religions are equal, really means all peoples are equal before my son. And that's true. All people are called to salvation in Jesus Christ. That's what it means. Okay. There's another message, I think, that might be related to this, and I'm not even sure if this is authentic. It's usually raised by objectors to Medjugorje, and I've not been able to find the message in any body or collection of authentic messages from Medjugorje. And it's something like, God is sovereign over all religions, or God rules over all religions. A quote like this. And again, I think we have to understand this, we have to understand it in context. Yeah, God is in charge of all religions, God is in charge of all peoples. That is clear. It doesn't mean that God has willed all religions, actively willed, as though there are different ways to God. There's only one way to God. And when we look at a message like that, we have to look at the context of all the other messages. Is there even remotely a suggestion that the Catholic Church is unnecessary? Is there even remotely a suggestion in all the other messages that you could make your own way to God bypassing Christ and the Church and the sacraments? No, there is not. So it's really unfair to kind of twist one isolated thing out of context and make a mountain out of a molehill, or a mountain out of a non-existent molehill. I think that is deeply unfair, because people who do that don't realize that their ancestors would have done it to Lourdes and Fatima. Okay, let's give an example. Let's try. I hate doing this, but I need to do this to show them that they would easily, if they had been alive at that time, they would have easily done this to Lourdes and Fatima. Lourdes, Our Lady allegedly says, I am the Immaculate Conception. Now you can object, and the pastor at the time did object. How can she say she's the Immaculate Conception? That's an event, okay? Not a person. What does she mean by that? That sounds like nonsense. You could twist it like that. And actually, as I said, the pastor did object and make those objections, precisely those objections. Now, to understand it, Our Lady is saying that whatever you mean by Immaculate Conception, that's me. I'm the one who received God's grace. I'm the recipient of God's lavish grace. So that's why she actually identifies herself with an event, with the beginning of her life. Okay, I mean, it's maybe because we're so used to hearing this, we have to realize how strange it was to the people who heard it at that time. What if Our Lady had said, I am the glorious Assumption? It's as strange as saying that. If Our Lady had said, I am the glorious Assumption, well, what does that mean? But you can twist anything out of context. Now, Fatima, there's more stuff you could twist. For example, in one of Our Lady's messages to Lucia, after the initial events, she said, I am holding back, or sometimes the message is given as, I alone am holding back the hand of God's wrath. Help me with your prayers and sacrifices. We have a quote from Pope Francis more recently where he said, Our Lady does not hold back the hand of God's wrath. So there you have a Pope speaking, and it contradicts an alleged message from Our Lady. What do you believe? Is Fatima fake? Now, we have to, when the Pope spoke and he said, Our Lady does not hold back the hand of God's anger, he's right. Literally, she doesn't. She does not hold back. God literally does not have anger, and neither does Our Lady literally hold back his anger. Now, metaphorically, God does have anger. God's love will manifest as justice sometimes. And that to us, with respect to us, we would call it anger, the righteous anger of God. God does punish out of love. And Our Lady holding back, or Our Lady alone holding back God's anger is an image of Our Lady interceding for us. But it's not like, God, even through his love, wants to punish the world and Our Lady is trying to stop him. If Our Lady is interceding for us, she does so because God wills her to. From eternity, he has willed for her to intercede with him, to be our great auxiliatrix, our great helper. She is the mediatrix of all graces. She is the one most intimately united with Christ in his redemption, and she is the great help of Christians. So you see how easy it would be to twist the words of Lourdes and Fatima against those apparitions. I mean, I think it's awful when people just take some things out of context, ignoring the rest of the body of the messages and making it into something that seemingly cannot be reconciled with the Catholic faith. I think that's dishonest, it's not fair, and it's also kind of counterproductive, because that same technique can be used against them and against every other apparition. Sometimes people object that Medjugorje has gone on for so long and it's still not yet approved. So the delay of approval is what they object to. Again, let's look at other apparition sites and see what's going on with them. So the average interval time for approval I've worked out is 64.8 years. So Medjugorje is 38 years currently. That still gives us 26 years before we're even average. Okay, but then really let's look at other places. I mean, the record breakers are Champion in Wisconsin, 151 years before approval. Šiluva in Lithuania, 167 years before it was approved. This gets harder to pronounce. This is in Poland. Ležajsk, 174 years. And Laus in France, Laus, 344 years before approval. So these are the kind of record breakers. So a kind of delay before approval also does not argue against the authenticity of an alleged apparition site. Okay. Another objection is that Medjugorje has become too commercialized, that there are too many restaurants and shops in Medjugorje. Now, first of all, I want to know, why is this an objection to the authenticity of the apparitions? And I think people are getting a bit confused when they use this as an objection, because remember that quote from the Bishop of Grenoble says, whatever happens after does not negate the initial authenticity of the phenomenon. So, is Medjugorje too commercialized? First of all, I think people who object to Medjugorje being too commercialized have probably never been to Lourdes. I know Lourdes has a head start on Medjugorje, at least 100 years, 130 years head start on Medjugorje. So things are far more developed in Lourdes. The hotels are huge, huge. There are lots of restaurants, some really fancy restaurants, lots of bars and pubs, even a cinema. All kinds of things are going on in Lourdes. Now, I've been to Lourdes many, many times. And what is true is that if you allow it, you can completely bypass the spiritual aspects of Lourdes and just, it would be just like a holiday in the south of France. And sadly, I think some people do treat it that way. And I object to that. But really, that's up to us. We have to go to Lourdes with the proper spirit and try and enter into the spirit of being a pilgrim. And if we do, then we will experience Lourdes. And the same applies to Medjugorje. I think yes, it's possible you could come to Medjugorje and completely bypass all the graces God is giving there. But that's up to you. If you don't like the commercialization, don't shop. Don't go into the shops. If you don't like the restaurants, don't go there. Do not go there. In fact, yeah, I'm telling you, honestly, especially the shops on a Sunday, if you disapprove of Sunday trading, and I do not go, do not do any shopping on a Sunday there at all. Let them all close. Let them all respect the Lord's day and shut and keep it as a holy day. Fine. As for the restaurants, I think restaurant is a fancy term for what we have in Medjugorje. They're more like slightly jazzed up cafes. But yeah, none of them are terribly fancy. In fact, when people come, they always say, oh, it's so cheap, everything is so cheap. People have to eat. So there are places that cater for that. But there's not that many. I think it is a shame when a pilgrimage site develops too much. I think it would be better always in all of these places if the bishops took charge, allowed a certain development and said, please keep the simplicity of the place, or put these other things further away. They are distractions. I don't like them. I don't think they should be in Lourdes or Fatima or Medjugorje or any other shrine. There's one shrine that I know of, which is quite simple, Walsingham in England. It's a 1,000-year-old shrine. It's in the middle of nowhere, and it is really, really, really undeveloped. Especially if you go there in winter, you have to drive at least 20 miles if you want to get lunch, because nothing is open in the village. So that has kept its character. But also that was aided by the Protestants coming and destroying everything there 500 years ago. So that kept it very simple. Okay. Sometimes people object that Medjugorje has gone on for too long. The duration of the apparitions is the objection. Now, this makes me kind of smile because I think, well, how long is too long? It's a bit like the question, how long is a piece of string? What would people be happy with? I don't think it's up to us to decide how long an apparition could be or should be. But let's just look at history. Let's look at other apparitions and see their duration. Okay, some apparitions began and ended in the same year, such as Guadalupe, La Salette, Lourdes, and Knock. Some were spread over years. Quibejo, 8 years. Amsterdam and Betania, 14 years. San Nicolas in Argentina, 35, 36 years, currently ongoing. Los in France, 54 years. Fatima, 1 year, but then the apparitions continued to Sister Lucia for another 88 years until she died. So how long is too long? I think the length that the apparitions are spread over, that's not really a good objection. And following on from that objection, people say, hasn't the local bishop condemned Medjugorje? So how could we go there? Bishop Zanic condemned it, and then the authority was taken away from him and given to the Yugoslav Bishops' Conference. And then later his successor, Bishop Peric, also expressed his opposition to the phenomena of Medjugorje. Now, this, I suppose, caused confusion among people because, the bishop's against it. Are we allowed to go there? This, it probably sounds bad. If we go there, are we disobeying the local bishop, etc.? So the Vatican clarified this in response to a query, and this is a letter from then Archbishop, now Cardinal Tarcisio Bertone. And he explains, on the basis of the investigation made at Zadar, so far, it cannot be affirmed that one is dealing with supernatural apparitions and revelations, i.e. non-constat de supernaturalitate, the middle category. And then the bishop went on to say what Bishop Peric said in his letter of 2nd October 1997 to the Secretary General of Famille Chrétienne, declaring, quote, "My conviction and my position is not only non-constat de supernaturalitate, but likewise constat de non-supernaturalitate of the apparitions or revelations in Medjugorje," close quote, should be considered the expression of the personal conviction of the Bishop of Mostar, which he has the right to express as ordinary of the place, but which is and remains his personal opinion. Okay, so that's what Rome had to say about this. It said the bishop's objection remained his personal opinion, that the duty and the competence to judge Medjugorje had then gone to the Bishops' Conference of Bosnia and Herzegovina, of which he was a member, but with at least 2 other bishops. The objection that the bishop objects to it, we can see Rome herself intervened to clarify that that was not a valid objection to Medjugorje. Another objection is, hasn't the church already condemned Medjugorje? So how could we even go there or listen to it? Now, when we look at how the church deals with an alleged apparition, there are 3 judgments Holy Mother Church can make. The first category is constat de supernaturalitate, meaning this is established as supernatural. So that's confirming that this place is worthy of belief. Okay. The second category is non-constat de supernaturalitate. It is not established as supernatural, which kind of signals doubt about this. It's not established. It could be supernatural, it could not be, but we're not entirely sure just yet. Okay? And then there's a third category, which is constat de non-supernaturalitate. It is established as non-supernatural. Now, this is complete rejection. This is definitely not from God. This is not supernatural. It would be a rejection. So you have approval and rejection, and in between you have could be, we're not sure. So Medjugorje belongs to the middle category, because it is true the local bishop there objected to Medjugorje. Bishop Žanić, at that time he was the Bishop of Mostar, and although he initially said Medjugorje is supernatural and he believed it, etc. Initially that was what he said, and then later he changed his mind. Then Holy Mother Church intervened and took away the responsibility for judging Medjugorje in these terms from the local bishop and gave it to all the bishops of Yugoslavia, the country where Medjugorje was in at that time. So it's the Bishops' Conference of Yugoslavia who met in Zadar, it's a coastal town on the Dalmatian coast, in 1991, and they chose the middle ground, that this is not established as supernatural, meaning that they don't know. If they're not approving it, they're not rejecting it. Now, I want to give you a little quote from Pope Benedict about private revelation, just to explain, because he explains so beautifully. He says, church approval of a private revelation essentially means that its message contains nothing contrary to faith and morals. It can be a valuable aid for better understanding and living the gospel at a certain time. Consequently, it should not be treated lightly. It is a help which is proffered, but its use is not obligatory. So he says, first of all, when church approval of an apparition is just basically saying there's nothing in it against our faith and morals. Fine. It's not saying we approve of it 100% and you've got to implement this in your life. No, Holy Mother Church is not saying that. But at the same time, he says it should not be treated lightly. It's a help that's offered, but it is not obligatory. So, I don't know, it's a bit like you're in the sea, splashing around, someone throws you a life ring or buoy or whatever. It's not obligatory to cling on to it, but if the seas are rough, maybe you'd be better off taking it. It's a help in this sense. Another objection about Medjugorje is an incident in the life of Mirjana, one of the visionaries. She had a neighbor called Pasha, who was a Muslim, an older woman, and there was allegedly a message where Our Lady said something like Pasha and there are different versions quoted on the internet, that Pasha is the holiest among all of you, or is the most devout, that's the one I've most commonly come across, is the most devout person among you, or is an example of devotedness. Now, I remember talking to Mariana. She says she doesn't remember saying something like that, but she does remember noting Pasha's strong faith. Okay, now bear in mind Pasha is a Muslim. So this is from Mariana's book, where she says on page 22, an older Muslim woman named Pasha lived alone in the apartment below ours. She did not have any family nearby, so my parents treated her like she was part of ours. If something broke in her apartment, my father fixed it, and when we invited Pasha over for dinner, my mom prepared the meal according to Islamic law. The food most beloved to God, Pasha would say, is food shared among many people. Pasha became quite fond of me, and she started to call me Mala Plavusha, or little blonde thing. Sometimes when I was outside in the park, she opened a window and shouted, "My little blonde, will you go buy me some bread?" Even if I had to leave my friends, I never said no. Buying things for Pasha gave me the opportunity to chat with her. Although she probably could have gone shopping herself, I think she enjoyed the company. And with Grandma Yela being so far away, she became like my surrogate grandmother. Pasha loved to speak about God, and she admired our Catholic beliefs. Hold on to your faith, she used to tell me, and when you get married, choose someone who shares your beliefs. It's best for your children. So here we have a lovely little anecdote about Pasha. Basically a family friend, more or less, treated like a surrogate grandmother by Mariana's family. And here Mariana says that Pasha had a strong faith and also kind of encouraged Mariana in her Catholic faith. Didn't ask her to convert, didn't try and make her Muslim or anything like that. So there's allegedly a message where Our Lady is supposed to have remarked upon Pasha's strong faith and encouraged them to have such a faith. Well, what's wrong with that? I think, she's not saying be a Muslim. She's saying be strong in your Catholic faith. And in fact, Pasha says be strong in your Catholic faith. So that's a good example for all of us to listen to and heed. Yet another objection is that the messages of Medjugorje are too repetitive, that Our Lady is repeating herself over and over again. Okay, now I think this is fairly a straightforward objection to answer. You just have to think about every mother in the land. How often do they tell their kids to come down for dinner or clean their rooms, wipe their feet, do their homework? Because this objection is saying that if they repeat themselves, they're clearly fake. That doesn't make any sense. If they have to repeat themselves, their children are bad children, disobedient children, unwilling to listen. If Our Lady has to repeat herself in Medjugorje, then the same is true of us. We are bad children, unwilling to listen, disobedient, stubborn.